Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all our online viewers, wherever you may be. My name is Russell Hsiao. I am the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a bi-weekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, public seminars, an annual symposium, scholarships, and as well a GTI podcast series. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, you may do so by visiting our website at globaltaiwan.org. Before we begin today's program, I would just like to thank our co-founders, our directors, our advisors, and all the staff and interns here at GTI who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. We're delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar entitled US-Taiwan Relations in the 21st Century, an Expanding Global Economic Partnership. The purpose of today's discussion is to preview a forthcoming report that GTI will publish, entitled by the name of today's seminar, which will examine the ways that the United States, in consultation with Taiwan and like-minded partners, can help Taiwan strengthen relations with its diplomatic and non-diplomatic partners, actively participate in international organizations, and specifically to expand its regional and global economic ties. Today's panel discussion will focus primarily on the economic discussions of Taiwan's international space. Two contributors of that report, which includes myself, are on the panel today. Now, before we proceed to the panel discussion, I have the distinct honor to be able to introduce the opening remarks by Ambassador Hsiao Bi-khim, the representative of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office to the United States. Ambassador Hsiao assumed her position as Taiwan's representative to the United States in July 2020, after serving as a senior advisor to the president at the National Security Council of Taiwan. Ambassador Hsiao also previously served 4 terms in Taiwan's legislature and has held numerous positions in government as well as in the party. So we are delighted and honored to have Ambassador Hsiao here today. Ambassador, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Russell and the GTI for convening this discussion. I'm pleased to have with us such a fantastic panel of experts. I see Ambassador Kurt Tong, Bob Wang, and Riley Walters here. With your support, our partnership is growing from strength to strength by the day. Let me begin by congratulating the Global Taiwan Institute on the completion of this excellent report, which offers insightful analysis and recommendations to cement the US-Taiwan global partnership in the 21st century. One of the things you can always count on GTI is their unique focus to bring together a cadre of trusted advisors to advocate for a stronger Taiwan-US relationship, a relationship that is not only critical in the Indo-Pacific region, but taking on a global significance. Today's discussion comes at a time when major geopolitical realignment is taking place, driven by a compounding set of global challenges ranging from the continuing battle against COVID-19 pandemic, disruptions to global supply chains, inflationary pressures around the world, to the ripple effects of Russia's unjust invasion of Ukraine. These challenges brought home how important Taiwan is to the world. Over the past 2 years, Taiwan has emerged as a global success story from its management of the pandemic, now weathering the Omicron tsunami without imposing severe lockdowns. Meanwhile, the semiconductor shortage put a spotlight on Taiwan as a leader in global supply chains. The war in Ukraine further raised attention to the similar threats Taiwan is facing, living next to another belligerent, authoritarian neighbor. Despite daunting challenges, our relationship with the United States and other like-minded countries continues to thrive. From Quad to G7, the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait has gravitated attention of world leaders. We also thank President Biden and Congress for passing legislation in support of Taiwan's meaningful participation in the World Health Organization. We're grateful for participating in the Summit for Democracy and the Global COVID-19 Summit to renew democracy, strengthen health systems, and safeguard human rights. From Lithuania to Japan, democracies stand shoulder to shoulder with Taiwan, just as the Czech Senate President declared, "I am Taiwanese." We are encouraged by the solidarity championed by our allies and partners in their words and deeds. However, your new report makes clear there are still significant steps left to take. Taiwan's industries, as well as our positioning in global supply chains, have made us a crucial player in the world economy. As such, it is imperative for Taiwan to be included in the regional economic integration. We remain eager to contribute to the newly launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and appreciate the support of an overwhelming number of bipartisan members of Congress on this initiative. Building on the success of the US-Taiwan Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue, or the EPPD, and the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, TIFA, talks, Taiwan stands ready to play a meaningful role in advancing our economic future, ranging from supply chains, resiliency, infrastructure cooperation, telecommunications security, clean energy, science, and technology. To ensure the world remains safe for freedom and democracy, Taiwan will continue to stand with the US and like-minded partners to strengthen the rules-based international order, expedite economic recovery, and protect a free and open Indo-Pacific. I want to close by thanking everyone again at GTI for your contributions to these noble efforts, and I wish you a great success. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Hsiao, for those very thoughtful and incisive comments. I cannot agree more with you on the importance of integrating our respective approaches to supporting democracies and deepening economic engagement among democracies. It is vitally important, I think, to rebuild the connective tissue that binds nations together in the rules-based international order. And as recently reiterated by President Joe Biden, U.S. policy towards the Indo-Pacific is intended to promote both democracy and an economic framework for the region. And it will also maintain longstanding American commitments to Taiwan. We at GTI look forward to contributing to further strengthening ties between the United States and Taiwan by contributing to a more informed discussion on such important policy relevant issues. Ambassador, I know that you have to leave for your next meeting, so thank you once again for your support, and we look forward to continuing our cooperation with your office.
Thank you again. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to invite our panelists back onto the virtual stage, whom I will introduce in the order that they will be speaking briefly. First, we'll have Bob Wang, who is one of the lead contributors to the report that we are about to publish. He is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He is also a member of GTI's advisory board. Bob was a career Foreign Service officer in the U.S. State Department from 1984 to 2016. Next, we'll have Riley Walters, who's a deputy director of the Japan chair at Hudson Institute, as well as a senior non-resident fellow at GTI. He's also a prolific writer on Asia economic and trade issues, and I always read what Riley has to say when he publishes. Last but not least, as a discussant, we have Ambassador Kurt Tong, who is a partner and member of the executive committee at the Asia Group. Prior to joining the Asia Group, Ambassador Tong served as Consul General and Chief of Mission in Hong Kong and Macau, and also as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department, among many other government postings. Now, we do want to hear from our live audience members. You may submit your questions anytime you would like. We will reserve around 15 minutes at the end of the session to take as many questions as we can. Questions for the panelists may either be sent by email to contact@globaltaiwan.org or through the chat function on the YouTube page. You can also tweet us at Global Taiwan. I've asked each of the speakers to prepare about 10 minutes for their opening comments, and then that will be followed by a facilitated discussion, and we will then conclude with the audience Q&A. I'll repeat these instructions again later on in this session. Bob, turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks Russell for the introduction and also for putting this event together. I think which comes at a very, I think, timely moment in terms of U.S. policy towards China and towards Asia as a whole. I'll try to make my comments short, so let me get started. Basically, what I try to do in the paper is focus on two questions. The first question is, why should the United States work with Taiwan to help Taiwan expand its economic ties to the United States, to other countries and other economies? And the second question is basically, how should we do this if, in fact, that's what we should be doing, both Taiwan and the United States? So to answer the first question, I think I'd actually like to draw people's attention to the recently revised fact sheet statement in the State Department website. Both Kurt and I worked for the State Department for quite a few years. And I want to draw attention to this statement, which I think the revised one in May that came out, which I think is much stronger and much more accurate in some ways, current than the previous one. And I think it also answers the first question, I think, quite well, fairly generally, but quite well. So let me just read a couple of sentences from that to, I think, essentially express the position of the United States on the question of Taiwan and cooperation with Taiwan. In the first paragraph, it just says, quote, as a leading democracy and a technological powerhouse, Taiwan is a key U.S. partner in the Indo-Pacific. The United States and Taiwan share similar values, like Ambassador Hsiao said, deep commercial and economic links, and strong people-to-people ties, which form the bedrock of our friendship and serve as the impetus for expanding U.S. engagement with Taiwan. It also goes on to say that Taiwan has become an important U.S. partner in this case, in trade and investment, in health, semiconductor, and other critical supply chains, investment screening, science and technology, education, and finally, advancing democratic values. And the fact sheet goes on and points out that Taiwan now has moved up to become America's 8th largest trading partner, as opposed to 10th, 9th, 11th before. And so this is, I think, an important development. But as I point out and argue in the paper, I think there are even more specific and, in fact, more urgent reasons why the United States should work more closely with Taiwan to help Taiwan expand its international space in the economic sphere as well. And the main point I made here is that the United States needs Taiwan, essentially, to be able to successfully counter China's, I guess, unfair trade practices and predatory industrial policies, as we've seen in the Made in 2025 plan, aimed at essentially undermining and threatening to undermine a U.S. competitive advantage in terms of advanced technology. So this is a very key Chinese goals, and a key U.S. policy goal today clearly is to counter that. And I think Taiwan is going to play a very important role in doing so. And I think the importance of this priority for the United States can be seen, for example, in the recent visit by President Biden to Asia, where in Korea, he made a point to visit the Samsung semiconductor plant in Seoul. And it was publicly announced at that point that, maybe even earlier, but at least at that point, that Samsung will be building a similar plant at the cost of something like $15 billion worth of investment in Texas, in the United States. So in this general context, I think it should be clear to everybody in our audience and so on that Taiwan is going to play a very critical role in this as well, because Taiwan, as stated in the fact sheet, is a technological powerhouse today in the world, leading in semiconductors with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC. And TSMC has also apparently committed to build a $12 billion semiconductor fab plant in Arizona. So clearly Taiwan is going to play a critical role in this competition between China and the United States in the advanced technology area. So very critical. But the problem comes now because, as I try to detail in the paper, because China recognizes the critical role of Taiwan. So it's putting immense pressures, increasing pressures on Taiwan across the full range, from economic to political, and finally now increasingly military pressure on Taiwan to essentially discourage Taiwan from closer cooperation with the United States. And apart from these coercive measures, we see that China has been also using incentives to try to lure Taiwan engineers and scientists to work in China. Again, in this technological sort of competition with the United States. And they've also set up what I guess are, what people report are front companies that will be able to sort of discreetly lure Taiwan engineers and scientists to work for China. So this is quite critical. And finally, I think more relevant to this discussion, China has tried in every way possible to try to block Taiwan from engaging with other countries in terms of free trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, regional trade agreements like the RCEP, regional, I forget now, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, I think. And of course, China has applied to CPTPP, hoping that once it gets in there, it can block Taiwan from entry as well. So this is a major goal for China, priority to block Taiwan, isolate Taiwan, so that it can then gradually pull Taiwan and Taiwan's businesses and people into the Chinese orbit in its competition with the United States in this area. So that's the problem. And unfortunately, it succeeded quite a bit. For example, even, frankly speaking, in the US-led Indo-Pacific economic framework, clearly Taiwan was not included because of the concerns of many of the members there, of the 12 partners in this framework, about China's possible reaction to Taiwan's inclusion. Because otherwise, there's no reason to exclude Taiwan, because it's a technology powerhouse, it's advanced, it's a fair market economy. So there's no reason to exclude Taiwan, except for the fact that members of IPEF are concerned about Chinese reaction. So while trying to resist this, clearly I think the Taiwan administration has been trying to resist these pressures from China. While trying to resist it, I think we can all understand why Taiwan would be quite vulnerable to China's pressures. I mean, after all, China is Taiwan's #1 trading partner, historically speaking, built up since the 1990s. And now, in fact, I think the latest statistics has Taiwan exporting about 1/3 of its products to China, which is very, very large as compared to other countries. I think for the United States, it's something in the neighborhood of 13-14% to the United States, but about 34-35% to China. And historically, China has received about, or Taiwan has invested about, I think, over $150 billion of direct investments in China. So all of this gives China a lot of leverage over Taiwan. And Taiwan is trying to resist that and trying to expand and broaden its economic ties with other countries to be able to reduce the leverage that China might have would have on Taiwan. And and if China is successful, if Taiwan is increasingly isolated, then frankly, Taiwan, maybe not under this administration, but maybe under future administrations, will have no choice but to move closer to China in this competition on technology, because Taiwan business people and Taiwan people in general, like anybody else, are going to be focused on their livelihood, on their essentially their welfare. And so with all of this pressure and being isolated, it's going to be very difficult for Taiwan to resist, I think, these pressures. And frankly, again, I tend to be quite frank, but there are still many people in Taiwan who question U.S. credibility in terms of its commitment to Taiwan, whether it's the policy of strategic ambiguity, which of course Biden clarified a little bit better in Japan, which is good, I think. But there's still a lot of people questioning U.S. commitment. They're looking at the United States and saying, why does the United States not do anything in terms of free trade agreements with Taiwan? What isn't it supported in IPEF, in the Indo-Pacific economic framework? So a lot of people are still questioning this. And so if this continues, if Taiwan keeps being isolated, then it's going to be hard for future governments and this government to resist the Chinese pressure. So the bottom line is that if this happens, China will benefit from it, and China will gain in terms of its technological competition with the United States. And so the bottom line is that for all of these reasons, I think the United States, in its own interest, should be helping Taiwan expand its economic ties with other countries and with other economies, regionally or bilaterally. Okay. So that's the first question. The second question was just how to do this, and there are a lot of proposals, but I think I agree with the point that I think Kurt Tong, one of our other panelists, made in the recent op-ed in The Hill, and that is the most important thing at this point, and you can't really delay much longer. The United States must move forward to start negotiating a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I mean, since I was served in Taiwan in AIT in 2006 to 2009, Taiwan has been making this request, and we've not really responded to it in a strong way. And I think it was reported in the press that Minister John Deng, who met with USTR, Catherine Tai in APEC in Bangkok last month, again made this request. So I think it's about time for the United States to think about acting more boldly in this regard, to try to move ahead, whether it's the free trade agreement or maybe along with that a bilateral investment agreement. I think it's time to move if this is important for the United States. And of course, in this area, the United States will have nobody else to blame in some ways if it doesn't move, because it's a decision of the United States, not the 12 members of Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, not the CPTPP, but it is a U.S. decision. So if the United States does not move, then it's its own decision not to move, and I think that would have consequences for the United States as well. Beyond that, I think, meanwhile, I think even without an agreement, the United States and Taiwan can work together to promote bilateral investments, especially in the technology field. TSMC, as I mentioned earlier, will be investing in Arizona in the United States. I think Microsoft, Google, Apple are setting up data centers, et cetera, in Taiwan. But this could be really increased much more to really solidify the relationship between the US and Taiwan, especially in technology. And the third thing I would say is, apart from not being included in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, at this point, the US, as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, can and should really actively coordinate with Taiwan in terms of the issues of IPEF. And I think that would be very important, and maybe include Taiwan in some other bilateral regional mechanisms with either Korea or Japan that we currently have. And more broadly, finally, I think the United States should engage with Taiwan, cooperate with Taiwan to promote, health security, inclusive growth, and so on and so forth in Southeast Asia and in South Asia, as as we see in Taiwan's own new southbound policy, and as we see in U.S. AID projects in Southeast Asia. I think we should be doing much more on this to again include and involve Taiwan together in regional economic developments. Okay, I'll stop there and let the others tell me where I went wrong. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I think I really take, needless to say, of course, that I agree with much of what you said. But I take, I think a special sort of a highlight on, the importance of the, a recognition of the importance of the economic track for enhancing Taiwan's international space, and unfortunately, despite I think the recognition of the importance of enhancing greater economic connectivity, by the Biden administration in the launching of IPAF, and also on another separate track of the Summit for Democracy. I fail to see right now an integrated approach that I think is far more necessary in order to really, I think, not only compete, with China, but also to reinforce and to rebuild the free and open rules-based order, and I think really the absence of Taiwan in the launching of IPAF was really a serious missed an opportunity. I think I take your point that there are both multilateral and bilateral initiatives that must be considered in how to enhance Taiwan's economic connectivity with the United States and the world. But what seems to be, certainly I think that there's an opportunity here for the bilateral side, given what appears to have been, at least right now, a missed opportunity with the launch of IPAF. But how do we sort of look at other multilateral forums? And we'll get into this. I want to get into this in the discussion. But other multilateral forums that could be potentially utilized, and for the process of trying to enhance Taiwan's international economic space. I think that's critical, just given the marginalization of Taiwan and isolation of Taiwan in a lot of the regional economic groupings that are being formed right now. And so I'm not thinking this in sort of either or terms. I'm thinking that we just need to talk about all of them. But we'll get into that discussion. So I'll tee that. I'm just teeing that up right now for you. Riley, I'm going to turn it over to you now, please. Over to you, Riley.
Thank you, Russell. I agree with so much of what Bob said, so I'm going to really keep this short, I think. I think, Bob really touched on a lot of important issues. One, the importance of the US-Taiwan relationship. Obviously, we do have strong trade, investment, people-to-people ties between our two countries. And so, there's strong, I think that builds strong momentum. And some of that is reflected at the top. When Biden says he'll defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion, I think, that kind of is indicative of some of that sentiment. But there is, I think, a frustration with U.S. policy at the same time, and one it's frustration that's shared, I think, internationally, particularly aimed at the U.S.'s economic and trade agenda, or lack of a trade priority. The Japanese, for example, have for years been, even over the weekend, have been, making the case for CPTPP, for the U.S. to get back into it. Obviously, that's not happening because the U.S. clearly lacks a trade strategy. And the launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, while Biden administration officials argue that this is their answer to it and that it's somehow better than a traditional trade agreement, I don't think it really cuts the mustard in other capitals. And so it In a way, it's disappointing on two levels. The launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, one, isn't as substantial as I think a lot of people would hope it'd be. One argument being that, you know, the standards or the goals have been so lowered so that the United States could cast a wider net to include more countries into its initial negotiations, is one argument to be had. I guess that is great when we're talking diplomatically and we just want to try to gather as many partners as possible. Economically speaking, you know, when we think about what are going to be the meaningful outcomes of this in the future, I think that's still up for debate. If we even have results, you know, we might not see results on some of these negotiations for years. You know, Biden administration might not even be in office by the time we get some rules made on some of these negotiations. And the second disappointment is, of course, Taiwan is not a part of the initial launch of this framework. You know, it is indicative of a U.S. policy that kind of keeps Taiwan at an arm's length when we're talking about economic policy. Bob and Kurt, I think they've both made the argument. I've made the argument. Russ, I think you've made the argument for years that the U.S. and Taiwan need a free trade agreement. My former place of employment, the Heritage Foundation, just recently came out with a stellar report actually arguing about the economic benefits of a free trade agreement with Taiwan, using more recent data and basically saying that doing so would have significant economic boosts for not just the US and Taiwan, but in fact, it would hurt China economically as well, which I think a lot of people are interested in these days. But going back to IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, you know, Taiwan being left out, I think, goes to show that the U.S., when it comes to economic policy in Taiwan, still has not grasped that Taiwan is continually isolated in the international space. And, you know, it is nice that we have these high-level bilateral dialogues, right? The TIFA, the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, which we've been having for decades. The more recent Economic Prosperity Partnership dialogue with State Department, also, you know, great. And then more recently, the Technology Trade and Investment Council with Commerce Department, which we really haven't seen develop yet. I think that might sort of end up as a consolation prize for Taiwan not being included in IPEF at this time, but still, I mean, those are great initiatives, but again, as Bob was sort of pointing out, the problem is that Taiwan has trouble getting into these international economic agreements, and it needs help, and the United States doesn't particularly seem to be very helpful in this regard. It could be that I wouldn't say that it's necessarily because of a neglect of Taiwan, because the bilateral relationship does do so well. I do think, though, it is maybe more of a symptom of a failure of U.S. economic policy. You know, this administration is very similar to the previous administration in their distaste for trade, and how they feel that traditional trade, whatever that means, has failed the U.S. population. I disagree. I think free trade has helped us immensely. It's not just helped you know, our economy grow. It's helped all levels of you know, Americans do better, afford more things. It's really, you know, helped us progress as a society. And you know, a lot of the things that we see in this administration are just a continuation of the previous one. You know, there's very serious discussion about reform at the WTO. I think Taiwan could actually be a very important partner with the United States in thinking about WTO reform. But you know, if the United States isn't willing to move forward on serious renegotiations or some sort of commitments on this, then it's a moot point to make. The other is, you know, one of the things I worry about IPEF, even though the United States is hosting the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation next year, I do worry that IPEF will be a distraction from this. Economics 101 is all resources are scarce. That means people's time. That includes people's times and diplomats' times. And so when we're trying to negotiate something out of IPEF, whether it's on supply chains or infrastructure investment or whatever a digital agreement might look like with the 12 other initial members, that takes time, and it also could potentially take, political capital, and eventually, these things take away from other things. So it does worry me a little bit, but I do think that the United States does kind of need to get its priorities set and understand that Taiwan. This is just another symptom of Taiwan being isolated in the international space. Beijing might not be happy with IPEF, but they're certainly happy that Taiwan is not a part of it either, I think. And so it really is a problem going forward. And so we need better U.S. leadership on these issues. And a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement, I think, would certainly make the case for that. But I also believe that IPEF, I would actually have preferred to see a smaller IPEF with closer partners, including Taiwan, on some more meaningful things like export controls, investment screening, supply chains, semiconductors, things of these sorts, where we could potentially get an agreement sooner than 2 years, even at the risk of not having 13 members. Maybe we only have 6 members. So that would have been my preference, but it is what it is at this point. The only thing we can sort of do is continue to watch that and continue to encourage this administration that Taiwan isn't something that needs the US-Taiwan relationship isn't necessarily something that needs to be kept at the bilateral level. It needs to be encouraged to include Taiwan in its multilateral efforts as well. And I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Riley. I feel like there's a thread here that's going through both Bob's and your remarks, and it focuses on priorities. And I wondered whether or not this is not so much that the administration doesn't have the priority straight, but that these priorities seem to be operating on separate tracks, and they're not syncing up, right? I mean, again, like I said earlier, I think I applaud the Biden administration for launching the Summit for Democracy, but when there's an opportunity now to really kind of sync up the sort of the values track with the economic track and trying to be able to really reinforce the importance of democratic solidarity with the economic means to do so, that just just appears right now, at least at this point, that they're not syncing up, and more coordination and is necessary. And hopefully with the emphasis now on the administration's emphasis, at least, on establishing bilateral tracks, with Taiwan, through the TTIC, through EPPD, through TIFA, that there could somehow link this up with broader initiatives. It remains to be seen. I know that our first two comments here have been more reflective of critical views of the ongoing efforts, and perhaps some disappointment, just given the just the news cycle of what's transpired over the last few days. And I want to turn it over now to Ambassador Tong, who perhaps maybe might give a bit more of a more positive view on things, or add a bit more, even more substance to our ongoing discussion, for sure. So with that, let me turn it over to Ambassador Tong, and the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Russell, and thanks for including me in this nice event. I don't think I'm going to necessarily, I wouldn't frame things as like being negative versus being positive about current approaches, but rather being analytical and thinking, what can we do and what should we do given the situational laydown, and the fact that there are competing priorities or not entirely consistent priorities that the United States has. Taiwan is one of those priorities, right? But it's not the only one. I realize this is a Global Taiwan Institute, but there are a lot of things that this administration, any administration, needs to juggle, and so trying to figure out how to get to the right place with the most effective policy to achieve the objectives at hand. I think that's the kind of the approach that what I'd like to take briefly here. So to frame the issue in the broadest terms, the U.S. objective with respect to Taiwan policy is to maintain stability in the cross-straits environment so that there is not a war. I would expand that to so that there is not a Cold War either, and also then to, given Taiwan's likely, in that context of stability, continued existence as a largely separate entity, certainly in economic terms, then the U.S. should figure out ways to harvest the benefits of that and reinforce economic growth and prosperity just for the United States as well as for the people of Taiwan. That's how I would frame the objectives that we're trying to reach here. Based upon that, the thing that I'm a little bit concerned about, I have no problem with the president's statement and that he made in response to a question about Ukraine and U.S. policy on Taiwan. I thought that was a fine sort of forward-leaning semi-clarification, if you will, about what the U.S. means about strategic ambiguity. And I thought the media completely got it wrong, calling it a gaffe. He knows what he's saying, and it's done it 3 times, and it's intentional. It's forward-leaning strategic ambiguity. But that is great, but there's a lot of time and attention being paid, not in today's forum, and I congratulate you for being more specific, but a lot of like chattering going on about whether the U.S. should be clearer, more ambiguous, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's the time for taking steps, practical steps, to accomplish the objectives that I mentioned at the outset. First of those steps would be continuing to do exactly what Taiwan is asking. I noted that after the president's statement, Taiwan spokespeople, both former government and current government, said, yes, please give us the means to defend ourselves, consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act. So that's obviously a high priority, not the subject of today's discussion. But in parallel with that, and in the U.S. self-interest, as demonstrated by the Heritage Report that Riley references, another thing the United States can do to bolster Taiwan's capability is to actually do something about strengthening economic relations and increasing Taiwan's international standing in a way that does not conflict with any other priorities, and which is entirely within the scope of U.S. action and in the U.S. national interest. And all it requires is a certain degree of political courage. So I think Bob or Riley referenced a piece that I put in the Hill a week or so ago, which is the same thing I've been saying for quite some time. So if Congress really wants to help Taiwan, and I'm saying this with a little bit of force here in case there's someone from Congress listening, why don't you do something about it, right? Don't pass another resolution or send another letter to the president. Article 1 of the Constitution says, trade is governed by the Congress. So you guys do it. On Capitol Hill, pass a piece of legislation that requires the administration to negotiate a trade agreement with Taiwan, bilateral trade agreement, by time certain, and provides the legal authorities therefore. And some of the details can be worked out about what exactly goes into the trade promotion authority that we provided by said legislation. But then this gets it out of this, because it's very tantalizing that Jake Sullivan and Catherine Tai both said something about having had a good meeting with John Dung, and maybe they're going to do an agreement, or maybe they're not. Maybe they're going to talk about doing something to take some of the pressure off the criticism they've gotten over the IPEF. situation. But I worry that will dissipate, and then no action will be taken, because this is an opportunity. If Congress thinks this is, I mean, there is very little to no cost to any industries in the United States of doing a trade agreement with Taiwan. That's just straight out. There is little. So just do it. You know, like, what is it? Is it Nike? Are we doing advertisements here for shoe companies? You know, just do it. So then what about IPEF? So I think that it's an interesting use of attention gathering for the Taiwan government and like-minded people in Washington to talk about Taiwan being included in IPEF, but it was never going to happen. It was just never going to happen because IPEF is not designed to capture the advantages that Taiwan has or to realistically accomplish its inclusion in a framework. It's just not designed for it. And I completely disagree with Riley that it would be okay for IPEF to be a small circle of industrialized, like-minded, advanced democracies. We've got that. That just needs to go deeper. IPEF was intended all along to reach out to India, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and get them into some kind of discussion with the United States, given the inability of the US to do TPP due to our political weaknesses in the United States. And so far it's working and it's successful. And I, bless them, wish them luck. It's going to be very difficult to do work in IPEF, but I do think that there are some practical achievements that can be reached. A digital economy agreement would be the foremost one, but there could be significant work done in supply chains. Jake Sullivan mentioned the idea of an early warning system for supply chain disruptions, which is a great idea. It's a little bit focused on China, I suppose, but it's also focused on the needs that these economies have with one another to share information, because everyone's concerned about supply chain disruptions. So just do that, do the climate piece, do everything in IPEF, and I don't think we should be criticizing it, except for a certain amount of self-criticism that the U.S. is a failure on doing broader trade agreements. But back to the Taiwan FTA, if we've got such a strong feeling about the need to help Taiwan an international space and strengthen an economic relationship with it, I think there's political capital to do that and overcome the reluctance to do trade agreements in general. The resistance from the labor unions, resistance from people that have bad memories about beef or fruit or whatever with Taiwan over the years. So then what else? The other last two things I would point out were APEC, because that was mentioned, and its relationship to IPEF, and then the question about doing something among a smaller circle of Asian economies. Last 2 points I'll make. I do share the concern that IPEF could detract from APEC, and wanted to use this opportunity to state this to some folks who might be in the audience. I think it's important for the US to do a good job with APEC and to do a good job with IPEF, realizing that they're different, the membership's different, and the objectives, while substantively very similar, because I think IPEF is much closer to APEC to being like APEC than it is close to being like TPP. But the US should still do a good job with APEC and let China screw it up or let Russia screw it up, and not have lack of attention from the United States lead to something like the current sort of Summit of the Americas not so great situation that looks like it's impending in LA quite soon. But really do a good job with APEC, come up with good things that can be done in APEC, and then do a good job in IPEF. And I recognize that Taiwan's going to only get
It appears we may have just lost Ambassador Tong, but let's give it a few more seconds to see if he might Zoom. Okay, why don't we proceed, and hopefully Ambassador Tong will get his connectivity back and he'll be able to finish off when he returns. Before proceeding to my the moderated discussion, I want to give a quick chance for both Bob and Riley to kind of react and respond to, some of the comments that have been made, by one another and also by Ambassador Tong. And then we'll go into the Q&A. It's okay if you don't have any comments either. Don't just let me know. Mm-hmm.
I'll just while he's not on video, I'll just disagree with whenever he disagrees with me.
Right.
No, I do want to say I am hopeful that IPEF works out. I do share some of the same sentiment. To be able to expand it to include partners like India and Vietnam, I think is essential as we look again toward focusing more on the region. And so I am hopeful for IPEF. What I've seen so far doesn't give me a whole lot to hope about. I mean, I do see it more as a diplomatic tool. But some people make the argument that this is just a framework at this point, and it's something to be built off of. And so hopefully that is something that can come from it. It's just, again, from what I see so far, I am a little questionable, as I encourage everyone to be, so we can actually encourage more to come from this. So,
But
Kurt is back.
We have Ambassador Tom back now. Kurt, are you there? Nope.
Whoops, he gone again.
I think you heard Riley and decided he's like, you know what? I think I'm gonna
Let me get out of here.
use this.
Yeah, if I could make a comment,
Please. Mm-hmm.
Russell. Yeah, no, I think there's a sort of maybe more discrete sort of line going through all of our discussions, and having been in the foreign, in the department and government for so many years, I do feel a little bit that the line is just that there's a lot of discussion, I think actually Kurt mentioned this in his the Hill thing. There's a lot of talk shops, and you talk and talk, and every administration comes in and you have a new initiative, but it takes a long time to get the commitments, and our political cycle doesn't really allow that to happen, every 2-4 years. So I think the time now is really, I would emphasize, is to take action. I mean, we propose going forward with FTA, just do it, and there are concrete actions. And some people talk about, returning to CPTPP with United States and Taiwan. I think it's going to be difficult, but if we really mean it and we really think it's important, then we got to do it. We can't just set up another mechanism and wait for another 2 years to come up with an agreement that we then somehow, because of our political cycle, give up. So I think we need to do something. I guess I would underscore that.
Ambassador Tong, we took the opportunity of while you were disconnected to start responding to your comments. Please, I want to give you an opportunity to finish up your thoughts, and then
I apologize. I apologize. Apparently, Verizon didn't like what I was saying. The last thought was, I think I don't know where it cut off, but was talking about doing a good job with both APEC and IPEF.
Yeah,
that's important. So that was conveyed. And then the other thing that I do think, and I'd pick up on what Riley said.
Uh-oh.
Right at the best part.
I'm beginning to suspect that it's you, Riley. I think every time he wants to respond to something that you're saying,
he was going to agree with me there.
Yeah. Well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here, how about this? Let's continue our conversation. And and if when we get Ambassador Tong back, we'll give him another opportunity to respond and finish his thoughts. But one of the points I wanted to pick up on, just so that we don't completely close the door now on discussions about IPEF, despite the fact that Taiwan was not included in the launch, is that the opening statement, the launch statement that was released by the members of IPAF did have a clause in there that I thought was noteworthy, and I'm just going to quote from it here, where it states that, and I quote, "We invite participation from additional Indo-Pacific partners that share our goals, interests, and ambitions for the region. And we are committed to collaborating with our framework partners in a manner that acknowledges the importance of technical assistance and capacity building, allows us to maintain a flexible approach, and delivers tangible benefits for our peoples," end quote. And I just wanted to, get your thoughts here in terms of, that seems to leave open to the possibility, right? And I think other analysts have and suggested it as well, that that leaves open to the possibility that Taiwan could be involved in some capacity on these tracks that are being sort of formed, these 4 tracks that IPAF is creating. And the negotiations for that, which will proceed in I think the next year or 18 months or so, will lead to a final agreement. What are your views in terms of the prospects, for Taiwan's inclusion? The ambassador mentions, in her opening statement, also Ambassador Hsiao, that Taiwan remains eager to be involved in IPAF, and so obviously I don't think Taiwan has closed the door here on its ability to participate. But what are your thoughts in terms of that? And after your responses to that question, I want to give Ambassador Tong a chance to finish his thoughts. I think we have him back here. Hopefully he'll go stay, and then we'll go with that. So IPAF tracks, the possibility of Taiwan being included in those tracks. Your thoughts?
Go ahead, Riley.
Sure. If we think about IPEF just as itself, the administration does say that perhaps some elements of the 4 pillars, or maybe even one or a few of the pillars themselves, might come out before 2 years are done. But I wouldn't count on many joining before they're finished. It's, I think this is typically the case for most trade agreements. It's to get what your initial members something done first before anyone else should be allowed to join. And so what that means for potentially Taiwan or anyone else in the region joining any of these pillars, it's something 2 years out. A lot can happen in 2 years, and even then, that would just indicate the beginning of negotiations for them to enter. I know this isn't a traditional trade agreement, and so potentially things could move a little bit faster, but I wouldn't. I'm a little bit pessimistic about anyone new joining anytime soon, and I mean that within the next 2 years at least.
Okay. Can I comment, Russell, or?
Yeah, go for it, Bob, please.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's sort of on the side of this. It's really in the margins, but it really actually addresses some of the things that Kurt and Riley have both sort of discussed, maybe with different views, apparently with different views, but not necessarily, in terms of the size of IPAF, and, should it be smaller, should it be larger, et cetera. It just alerted me to something that I've been thinking about, which is that the U.S. actually has a number of bilateral things, for example, with Korea on supply chain, or with Korea on working in Southeast Asia, with Japan on supply chain, and so on. So from that perspective, I've always thought that it would be useful, whether it's IPEF or whatever else, but it'd be useful just to have Taiwan included in some of these bilateral things. So in other words, Korea, trilateral, you might say. Korea already has a program with the United States supply chain. Taiwan is brought into it. And I think that would be in some ways much more significant, not much more, but a little bit more significant in the sense that it's substance, and they could just be brought into it. They have actually identical sort of goals and capabilities. And so more of these things, whether it's with Japan or Korea or Australia or whoever, some of the willing partners, you might say, could be more effective in some ways than the larger and more symbolic sort of IPAF or something of that nature. I think that's something the United States should consider.
If I could expand on that, on both comments, I'm not sure specifically to IPAF that the pillars will end up being pillars, and that they'll be defined at the end of the day as pillars. I think these are tracks for conversation, and what could be the likely outcomes of the IPAF discussions are a series of discrete initiatives that, rather than signing up for everything that's in a pillar, there being a program or an initiative or a project or an agreement that could come out from the conversation and have a certain number of participants. And once once things get to that stage of ripening, then I would think that the door would be open for additional economies to perhaps participate at that level, rather than the whole kind of discussion about who's on deck and who's in the club deck chairs conversation at the highest level of participation. And not to say that that's less, high, low, one's more significant than the other. It's more like general and concrete. And so, for example, if a digital economy agreement were reached among some subset of the 13 members of IPEF, then that could be written in such a way that additional economies could sign on to it, using an easier process perhaps than the signing on to TPP. So there are opportunities, I think, that could spin out from this. I do think it'll take time, and I share Riley's concern about whether the IPEF actually continues as a forum over the medium term, or is one of these things that kind of goes away with the political cycle. And there are examples of both in this situation. And APEC's a good example of one that now has significant institutional momentum and ability to survive political cycles and hardship and being ignored or mistreated by different partners. So anyways, that's some thoughts on that. And then, which brings me back to the point I've been trying to make, and each time gotten cut off, is that another area of very urgent activity that will not be in IPEF because of the membership, and is very important, is the whole question about, as was mentioned, export controls, investment restrictions, and the coordination of those policies, which can all fit under the rubric of technology denial, based upon the fact that the United States and its allies and partners are in an adversarial relationship with China, and that technology denial makes sense in that context. And so then how do you organize that? And Taiwan needs to be part of that substantively, given its technological capabilities and deep relationship with the PRC on trade and investment. So does the ROK, so does Japan, so does the United States, and it may be that also some European countries should be included in that conversation. I think that's going to happen. The seeds of it are already being laid in the conversation between Japan and the United States, managed by the Commerce Department, and the TTIC happening with Europe, that needs to be pulled out, prioritized, made more pointed in its organization. But when that happens, I'm not even say if that happens, I'm going to say when that happens. I think it will happen. Taiwan needs to be part of it, and I think pretty much everyone recognizes that, including Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. And China.
And China, but they can't do anything about it.
It's really fascinating comments there. I think maybe just pulling the thread here on the concept of technology denial and stretching it a bit to a question that I want to ask all of you. with regards to the war in Ukraine, which is, this war has really shown the importance of economic tools that could be used in a military conflict, but also the limits of them in terms of deterrence, at least in the case of Russia over Ukraine. My question would be then, how could economic measures be better crafted to act as a deterrent against China's coercion and potential use of military aggression against Taiwan? I was particularly struck recently when the former Japanese foreign minister and defense minister Kono Taro at an event here in Washington had called for the creation of a coalition of economies to start coordinating economic strategies that could potentially respond to China's active coercion, military aggression against Taiwan, with discussions about specifics of issues of products and reshoring or onshoring and measures like that. And I wonder whether this relates to some extent to the notion of technology denial, and whether or not what basket of tools and mechanisms can help facilitate that discussion and move that forward. Any thoughts by any of the?
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
I apologize. I think that the conversation that is politically realistic now, economically realistic now, is one of technology denial. And I think to define that more clearly, this does not mean technological decoupling on a broad scale, because that is self-damaging action by all countries to try on a broad scale to separate the technological ecosystems. That's not a benefit to the United States, but rather specific capabilities, materials, higher levels of technological activity, artificial intelligence, really cutting edge stuff that both has the possession of which has a economic development advantage, but also has a significant military advantage, or creates military advantage, and that should be husbanded and harbored by our team, right? Without going too far in disrupting the US-China or the Japan-China or the Taiwan-China economic relationships. So that is a difficult exercise to draw the line, organize it, deal with repercussions in terms of counter strategies from China, etc. That's enough. That's difficult in and of itself. So what Kono-san's saying is, let's, if I'm interpreting what I didn't hear him, but let's just use it as a straw man, and apologies if this isn't what he meant. But if the idea is to pre-cook retaliatory sanctions against China in a active military scenario or war scenario around Taiwan, I don't think that's possible. I don't think anyone will have that conversation, and that's a conversation that the Ukraine story demonstrates can happen very quickly and effectively when the time comes. But I pre-planning financial decoupling from China based upon the possibility of a war that's very unlikely to happen, I just don't see that being a sustainable exercise that people are going to want to participate in.
Can I jump in, Russell?
Yeah, please. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with Kurt on that. I think it's going to be difficult to do before pre-planning, etc. But to make a more general point, I think China understands that if there is a serious conflict in cross-straits or in the South China Sea, whatnot, that it is going to be significantly affected by anything that happens, because there's going to be a disruption, as you can see in the Ukraine, Russia situation, and China is much more dependent in some ways, in terms of its 20% of its exports, essentially, or its trade is the GDP, it's going to be, including with Taiwan, its connections with Taiwan. So I think it may not even be needed, in the sense that I think everyone realizes, I think Chinese leaders themselves realize, that any significant conflict will have significant consequences for China's economy that is so tied to the world. And so I'm not even sure that pre-planning necessarily is necessary in that sense, because I think they understand, and that's what's probably going to constrain them to some extent.
Yeah, I think one of the things we think about when we think of, for example, the Made in China 2025, one of the things that really I think sticks out, especially for the economists, is the argument that China's been making for years about self-reliance. And how difficult that has actually been for them to sort of build up these buffers against potentially economic coercive tactics. But one of the things that is interesting, since you mentioned Kono-san, one of the things that's been showing up in Tokyo recently is the new Kishida administration's interest in identifying choke points in its own economic interests, and either finding those that are a potential choke point against Japan, which they could alleviate, or potentially creating choke points for the Japanese that they could use at some point in the future. Again, kind of going to this, what if scenario where Japan has to use it. But I think one of the things that, kind of jumping off of Bob's point, is, so many countries are already integrated trade, not as much investment, but mostly trade with the Chinese economy, that, the scenario is it's different. It's 100% different than what we could sort of game out considering against the Russian economy. So
Yeah, and if I may just, trying to riff off of what, Riley and Bob have and combine sort of the comments here. And I think it kind of goes back to what Bob was saying earlier with the potential of building off of, sort of the US-Japan track and the US-Korea track to bring Taiwan into those conversations about, issues like, these choke points that are critical to these economies. And maybe that's, that's the entry, maybe those are some entry issues where where there are obviously, clear interest for, for these, countries to have, Taiwan involved, and in the United States can initiate that possibly within those dialogues. But just an idea that, kind of that was inspired by the conversation that we're having here. One of the, I think it's helpful to highlight that, I don't think there's a lot of forums in Washington, D.C. where APEC gets a lot of love. And it definitely did get a lot of love today in terms of a lot of our discussions, and it's except for, very specialized discussion on international economic issues. And I wanted to sort of, tee this up here because I do think, we have a lot of expertise on the panel on this issue, Bob and Kurt and Riley, all of you. But one of the things is that U.S. will be hosting APEC in 2013, right? And I wonder, and to weave Taiwan to the discussion here, is there an opportunity here for elevating Taiwan's ability to be able to participate more, more effectively in the process, in a greater presence in the APEC process, with the U.S. being the host in 2013. Any thoughts on that? Bob, maybe I want to get you started on that. Maybe I know you had some thought.
Yeah.
You certainly have some suggestions in terms of how APEC could be should be better utilized.
Yeah. Well, I guess when I can only go back to my own experience working, 2013 to 15 in APEC. What I really tried to do there, although, obviously it includes China, Russia, and the whole group. It's a very large group of 21 economies. But what I've really tried to do in APEC during my tenure there was find different ways to just work with Taiwan. I mean, for one thing, I visited Taiwan 4 times in 2 years as the APEC senior official. We worked on scholarship, fellowships, agreements, and so on with Taiwan. I think it's very important to emphasize the educational and training component of Taiwan's capabilities and its economy. And so we worked specifically with Taiwan to initiate a lot of things within APEC in terms of the broad range of things that we could do on inclusive growth, on health, on oceans, et cetera. So I simply tried to do that. And obviously, I think it had to be done in a more diplomatic way, but I think probably there were a lot more initiatives that the US took with Taiwan during this period. And I think we should continue to do that in the APEC context. Maybe Kurt has something to add.
I agree with all that, and I think APEC's a really good opportunity for Taiwan to show off its capabilities and strengths, and APEC can produce meaningful deliverables. It's also a very good place for sharing of best practices. I would expect that by 2023, things will have progressed far enough that it's time to do a retrospective on COVID. What was done right? What was not done right? Taiwan would be a very strong participant in that conversation. This is assuming that the United States has the courage to hold a mirror up to itself and point to its own flaws in response. As the U.S. being the host, that would be the most important. China probably would also find it a painful conversation. But that would be, I'd go for that. I don't know if everyone else would. And so a number of things like that, and just play up Taiwan, or play up APEC and the fact that Taiwan is a full member and treated as a full member, but following all of the precedents for the maneuvering through the diplomatic minefield of the fact that Taiwan, the PRC, and Hong Kong are all members of APEC.
If I could add one more thing, Russell, just one last sentence on this. I think what I also found very useful in APEC was that this was an opportunity, I thought, for, with US working with Taiwan, but for Taiwan to really raise its profile and you might say underscore its significance to a lot of other members, developing economies in Southeast Asia and other places about Taiwan's value to the region as a whole. And so I remember one particular case where there's I think it's called IDOC, but I forget what it stands for, but Taiwan was sending out a lot of its people to various countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, to teach farmers and others how to get into the digital world. And that was extremely successful, went on for many years, and people began to realize the role and the important role that Taiwan can help in development of these various economies throughout Southeast Asia and in Chile and in Peru as well. So I think that's an important channel, you might say, for Taiwan to expand its economic ties.
Yeah. But if I can just add one more thing. I agree with everything Bob said, and that was a great example. A big challenge and I think this needs to be, if our colleagues in the White House and the State Department need to be thinking about this now, is how to get through and help APEC recover from the fact that it's become a little bit of a wrestling match between the U.S. and China, rather than a plus-sum realm of the possible, results-oriented, try and have good conversations organization. And so I hope that U.S. leadership in APEC does not see it as an opportunity to try and embarrass China or trash talk it or set traps for it in policy sense, and that's an achievement, because that's very passing, doesn't really accomplish anything. Rather focus on things which are doable, plus some, because all of the other participants want APEC to be successful and help them have lessons for domestic policy that helps them develop better and creates relationships that helps them grow together. And so having that forward-leaning positive attitude. I think the biggest challenge now actually is going to be Russia. It sort of vaulted over the whole US-China problem. In fact, Russia's participation is going to be really problematic, and the U.S. and its friends saw fit to walk out, thought it was necessary, and I don't disagree, to walk out of the trade ministers meeting in Thailand. You can't walk out of your own meeting, so they're gonna have to figure that out. And they should start trying to figure it out now, because it's going to be a tricky pickle.
I just want to remind our live audience members that we are taking questions, and we do want to hear from you. And if you have questions, please send it to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or you can use the chat function on the YouTube page, or you may also tweet us at Global Taiwan. So I know that kind of USTR seems to be everyone's sort of favorite punching bag these days, and there's, I mean, I think, reasonable issues with how the USTR has approached Taiwan. But I think, to be fair to the Biden administration, it is, I think we should recognize the fact that they did resume TIFA in June of last year, and actually the trade negotiator Catherine Tai has held, I mean, 2 meetings already with, if not more, with with John Dunn, the minister without portfolio, and that's given a quite a long lull, and as I think both Bob and Kurt and Riley, I believe, also as well, have noted that they met in Bangkok just recently at the APEC trade ministers. I mean, isn't this progress? No, I mean, like, isn't this progress? And what should we make out of these meetings that are taking place? It seems like the administration is teeing up, something that may be coming down the pipeline. What are your thoughts in terms of this track in the bilateral trade and investment relationship between the United States and Taiwan? Are we moving forward? What are the prospects in your view in terms of some meaningful developments coming through these channels? Any thoughts on that, Riley? Maybe you want to chime in. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I'm just, maybe I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. I'm sort of pessimistic about it. I see 2 different things happening here. Again, sort of this dual track. The first is, the Biden administration, since campaign, has been prioritizing declaring diplomacy is back, right? And so I think one of their missions since the get-go has been to sort of rebuild some of the broken relationships the Trump administration caused. And I see the restart of TIFA as one of those means. Showing that, hey, I know you guys had TIFA on pause, but we're continuing it. So, diplomacy is back. But when we're thinking about, I think, the operations at USTR, I think the opinion actually for quite some time has always been that TIFA is actually the substitute to a free trade agreement, and that it should stay that way. The ability to have these high level dialogues is in a way they think perhaps superior to an actual formal trade agreement, which they, again, TIFA has shown that they can kind of control it in a way, stopping it, restarting it in that sense. And so I do appreciate that they restarted the TIFA agreement. I'm skeptical. I'm worried that, again, it'll become a replacement for anything beyond that.
Okay. Anything else from Bob or Kurt on that?
It's basically
Sure, just one.
Nice, but still unsatisfactory.
Okay.
I mean, just one comment. I think the thrust, if there's one single point, main point that I want to make in that paper that we're doing in this project, is that at this stage, the United States should recognize how important it is to act urgently if it is really serious about its highest priority in terms of tech competition with China, for example, and other issues, obviously in terms of trade and industrial policies, etc. I'm just hoping that this emphasizes how important it is for the United States to move ahead on this, and how critical a role Taiwan has to play in this in terms of the technology. If the United States understands that for its own purposes, for its own interest, then it will act and not simply keep talking, because Taiwan really does play a critical role. And that's what I try to put out in the paper. And I'm just hoping whoever is, in the administration really begins to understand this, not just theoretically, but concretely, and know the importance of having to act.
Wonderful, Bob. And then for everyone who's all paying attention, the report will be coming out very soon. So, so stay tuned for that, and make sure to, make sure to subscribe to receive our updates, so that you get it directly in your inbox as soon as it's released. So, visit our website at globaltaiwan.org and sign up there. Kurt, I want to get your thoughts on this because, you played a pivotal role in Japan's entry into the then Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now CPTPP, and Taiwan, has applied for, membership into CPTPP. Is there a role for the United States to play in helping Taiwan get into CPTPP?
I think the U.S. could try. The U.S. left,
Right.
so it makes it difficult, right? The U.S. is not a direct participant in the consultations within the TPP group, and they've got their own consultation process, their own discussions and decisions on how fast to go on which application and using what methodology and whatnot. The British are by far clearly the farthest along in joining TPP. There's active negotiations taking place. As always, these things they're difficult, and there are issues that crop up and get stuck, and etc. Based on my understanding of where things are, but it is progressing. So I would expect that you would see the UK joining sometime in the next year or two. And then Taiwan, China, and the Republic of Korea are next in line, and I think it's going to be a very difficult conversation for either China or Taiwan. Taiwan because of political concerns about retaliation among some of the Southeast Asian and Latin American members of TPP, and China because it's going to have a real hard time meeting the standards of TPP, given that in terms of domestic policy, on many fronts, they're headed in the wrong direction. Difficult to swallow politically for some members of TPP. So I think it's going to be a long and complex discussion for both. I think the U.S. position could fairly be, given its reduced standing in this equation, that the process should be transparent, should be fair, and should be based on the substance of the agreement. The U.S. has a lot of residual knowledge about the agreement, U.S. officials do, and could fairly say that, in their estimation, Taiwan is closer to meeting the standards. And so any outcome that ended up in the other way would seem odd. And that Taiwan should get a fair standing, a fair hearing, earnest negotiations, because it is a member of the WTO and a member of APEC, and that's the underpinning, the organizational underpinning of TPP. It's kind of a long answer there. I think Korea is going to jump the queue ahead of both, is the likely outcome. A major impediment there is the need for Tokyo and Seoul to sort out their relationship a bit and get that on a more constructive footing, because I think most of the TPP countries would be very enthusiastic about Korea participating.
Well, finally, I want to invite our panelists to provide any concluding thoughts, maybe points that you really want to emphasize in terms of the economic partnership between the United States and Taiwan, because we are really approaching the close of our session, and I want to make sure that there's any important points you want to get off your chest. This is the time to do it. So Bob, maybe why don't we start with you if you have any comments that you'd like to make, final comments you'd like to make.
Yeah, sure. I've already made the comment earlier about the importance for the United States to understand the the significance of Taiwan, et cetera. And I just want to underscore again, I guess, that if this does not happen, if the United States does not really act quickly and boldly in this case, there is a serious, I think, concern that Taiwan may be drawn into the Chinese orbit, because if China is able to continue to isolate Taiwan, and if the U.S. doesn't respond in any way, and nobody else really does respond, again, the danger then is China will have the ability, coercion or otherwise, or incentives, whatnot, to really do this and to really pressure Taiwan. And I'm not so entirely confident that Taiwan businesses, people, students, tech scientists will all be able to resist this. And if that happens, that's going to be a major blow to the United States in terms of our position and our competition with China. And I think, again, you would just emphasize U.S. government officials need to understand that quickly and not really keep on dilly-dallying down the road.
Can I just say one sentence on that? Is that the U.S. has gotten used to the idea rather quickly in the last 2-3 years that China only knows how to use sticks, but that's not the case. And there's a very interesting piece in Associated Press this morning about a major initiative by China in the Pacific Islands, which is all carrots, and pretty big ones too. Yummy carrots for Pacific Island countries. And so the assumption that China will always be ham-fisted, a bunch of wolf warriors running around doing self-destructive behavior, that's not the case. So people shouldn't underestimate that. And then just, my final conclusion is two priorities I put first: bilateral trade agreement and a focused technology management conversation among a small circle of key technology countries. Those should be the two top priorities that everyone should be talking about. Others are important as well. Those are the top two.
Okay. Riley, final word.
All right. It's in Beijing's interest to isolate Taiwan and continue to do so. And that is not in America's interest. And so I think we need to support Taiwan, not just bilaterally, but internationally as well. I think we tried that. We continue to try that, for example, at the World Health Assembly, not always successfully, but it's something that we need to continue. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to show our support for Taiwan with a free trade agreement. And it's something that it's been a long time coming, and it needs to happen. So those are my final thoughts. Is one, we need to support them, but to do so, we need to do so bilaterally as well. And it's not necessarily just in Taiwan's interest; it's in our interest as well. And to understand that, I think we can go forward.
I've said it better myself. So with that, I want to thank our panelists, Bob Wang, Kurt Tong, and Riley Walters, as well as our featured opening remarks by Ambassador Hsiao Bi-khim. Thank you all for your time, and until the next time, take care.